Thank you so much, Gerard and Alex, for that introduction and for sharing with us a positive, empowering, affirming view of a regular, normal marital relationship to which everyone is entitled and is a goal for many people, whether they do or do not experience serious mental illness. And I'm so delighted to be here today to talk about that, to say a bit about the research, and to try to inspire all of you who are obviously interested in this topic, or you wouldn't be here, to think about the different ways that you as copers, as service providers, as family members, as administrators of mental health and health service systems can bring a topic that's ignored pretty much everywhere in mental health, not just in Israel, but where I come from in the United States, and all over the globe. I want to begin by telling you how delighted and honored I am to be here today, to share my knowledge with you, but also to learn from you. This is my first time in Israel, and I've been impressed from the beginning with your progressive and enlightened values and attitudes toward, first of all, recovery, which is still a concept that we fight about in the United States and is not fully accepted by all parts of the mental health system, by all parts of our society. Your endorsement of an evidence-based, effective, humane model, psychiatric rehabilitation services, and your use of it in the community, and your understanding of its meaning for recovery. And I also seem to have lost the, can you still hear me? No. What's me? How about now? Ah, here we go. And I also want to, good now? So maybe a short in the electricity? Can you hear me without the microphone? Yeah? Would you rather wait for the microphone? I have a loud voice, but I'm not sure that it will last for an hour. Next time I'll do that. Isn't technology wonderful? All right, so I've complimented you on your embracing recovery as a value for your mental health system, for your endorsement of a model, not the only model, but a model that does have an evidence base, a very strong evidence base in helping people recover. And the last thing I want to say is how impressed I am with your involvement of copers in all phases of the planning for this project, this conference, and you're grappling with some very difficult, thorny problems about how to bring copers into the planning of your service system, the administration of it, and the provision of services. That is a challenging agenda, but my personal belief is that it's necessary for people to recover because there is a dimension of recovery from this disability that we cannot truly embrace without partnering with copers. I also want to thank Ben Gurion University, particularly the Department of Social Work, including the chair, Professor Julia Mirsky, and Professor Tamar Peleg, for hosting my visit and for making me feel so very welcome. And I'd like to start by talking about the importance of intimate relationships to an individual's well-being and the fact that we cannot overestimate that importance. Intimacy is an essential part of human experience that plays a major role in contributing to a person's overall well-being and quality of life. Such relationships may be long-term or they may be short-term. They may be heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, transsexual, or non-sexual, a decision that many people make and needs to be honored and acknowledged. In other words, sexuality is a human right. Emotional and sexual intimacy are important aspects of human connectedness. We cannot hope to help people recover from serious mental illness if we ignore these aspects of the human connection and condition. People cannot be truly whole without integrating these aspects into their personalities and into their lives. To talk about recovery and believe in it and say that it's a goal for us and not recognize the importance of sexuality, intimacy, human connectedness is a sham. And I think by having a conference such as this and focusing for an entire day on what is known, what are the barriers, and what are some of the solutions, is an attempt to fully embrace the idea that people can recover from serious mental illness. It's very hard for people in the profession and for family members, and even for copers themselves, to embrace the idea that even those with serious mental illness have the right to define and to express their gender identity and their sexuality in a way that's meaningful to them. And today I'll talk a little bit about the tradition and the history that's created these barriers and these difficulties. The recovery model is so exciting and different because it values clients' sexuality. The perspective of recovery acknowledges everyone's capacity for personal fulfillment through sexual activity and sexual expressiveness. It focuses on helping people restore valued social roles. Up until now, the emphasis was only on some roles. What we're now grappling with is how to widen the array of roles that we help people embrace, how to make sure that when we do that, we respect people's culture, their religious values, their desires, their economy, their financial economy that they're forced to live within, and to do so in a way that is sensitive and supportive. Another aspect of recovery that's germane to today's topic is our need to support the sexual expression between consenting adults by providing people with the skills and even the materials that are necessary to engage fully in intimacy and sexuality. that includes providing contraception and information about contraception, as well as the skills, many of them difficult interpersonal negotiation skills for negotiating contraception and avoiding sexually transmitted diseases. It also includes recognition that some people, because of their psychiatric disabilities, did not get the socialization that others have gotten about those things that everyone finds challenging, like how to meet the right person, how to know that that's the right person, how to recognize the wrong person, how to enter and exit relationships in a graceful, respectful manner. All of those things are things that many of us learn naturally through living, through being in life, but aren't necessarily learned as easily by people who are grappling with serious mental illness. So the question is, how do we go back and help people learn? And how do we encourage copers to help each other do this learning? Many of you who have formal clinical training recognize this pyramid and recognize the name Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, published probably most notably in his book, Toward a Psychology of Being. And when you examine the pyramid, you see that sex is classified as one of the individual's basic life needs, along with food, drink, shelter, warmth, sleep, and even air. Fulfillment of this need is seen as essential to the higher order needs in that pyramid, such as safety and security, love and belongingness, self-esteem, and the highest order needs for self-actualization, such as meaningfulness, vitality, and creativity. Sex is at the base of that pyramid in the human condition, and its importance cannot be underestimated. The World Health Organization recognizes the right of the world's citizens to sexual health and defines that as a state of physical, emotional, and social well-being in relation to sexuality. It calls for a positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships for people with disabilities, including people with psychiatric disabilities, as well as the recognition of the possibility of having safe and satisfying sexual experiences, and the importance that sexual relationships be free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. And here, I just want to point out that our attitudes and our problems in grappling as service providers, family members, copers with this issue doesn't extend only to mental illness. It extends also to all people with disabilities, who we have tended to treat as asexual beings, as individuals without sexual desires or sexual needs. So we can't beat ourselves up too much in mental health for engaging in attitudes and values that really extend to other helping professions, particularly in the area of disability. I hope you have gingerbread men in Israel. Do you? No. So, for those of you who've never heard of a gingerbread man, it's probably going to seem a little weird. It's a cookie. It's made with ginger. It's sweet. It's typically in the shape of a man. And that's what this diagram represents. And I'm going to use that. And we're going to rename the gingerbread man to the genderbread person as a kind of an infographic, a visual representation that breaks down some important elements of intimacy and sexuality, so that as we go forward today, we don't wish them all together and fail to recognize that there are different concepts and processes, and that they emanate from different parts of our genderbread person. Let's start with gender identity. It's up in the head, the brain, the multicolored brain. It's how you think about yourself in your head. It's the brain chemistry that composes you. For example, your hormonal levels, as well as how you interpret what that means to you, your gender identity. Next is gender expression, and that's represented by that dotted line around the left-hand side of the gingerbread person. It is the manifestation, the outward manifestation of your sexuality. It's how you demonstrate your gender based on the way you dress, how you behave, and the ways you interact with other people. Next, we have biological sex. You all can see where that is, right? That's where we tend to think of everything emanating from this topic. And that can be a major mistake. What we're talking about today is not just between our legs. It's in our head, it's in our heart, and it's in how we relate to other people. But when we talk about biological sex, located in that private area, we're referring to objectively observable organs and measurable things like chromosomes, things like the vagina and the penis, X and Y chromosomes, ovaries and testes. And finally, we have in the heart sexual orientation. It's who you are spiritually and emotionally, and who you're attracted to, based on their sex and their gender in relation to your own. I'd like us all to try to keep these different aspects of sexuality and the sexual person separate as we think about some of the issues that we'll talk about today, not just in my presentation, but in many of the presentations. And think about them first individually and then as an integrated whole. But not to focus only on that part between the legs, because so much of recovery has nothing to do with that area of the body or that aspect of human relatedness. It's really important, I think, to ask ourselves, how much do we really want people to recover? I think that can be a radical question. Everyone's initial reaction is, well, to their fullest extent, to their ultimate capability. But we have to make sure that we really believe that and that we're prepared to support it in our therapeutic relationships with people, in the way we design our residential programs, and the rules that people have to live by when they live in our residential programs, whether we make contraception freely available to people who want to use it, and how we do or don't help support parenting in mental health programs versus saying, that's someone else's responsibility. We do mental health. We don't do parent training, child development, support. We don't have residences for people that want to live with their children because we can't afford that. While all of these things may be true, those kinds of attitudes and that kind of service system does not truly support recovery that includes sexuality and intimacy. The question is, by recovery, do we mean an average life or do we mean a memorable life? Ultimately, that's up to the individual, but it's up to us not to stand in the way. And I think part of what we want to talk about today is how to get out of the way while also being supportive and helpful. There are a number of reasons why people with serious mental illness may avoid intimacy and someone they're attracted to away because they care about them, because they're concerned that a relationship with them may damage that other person. A very sad way of caring about someone that you're attracted to. We've heard alluded to already the medication side effects that accompany many psychotropic medications, including decreased desire, decreased sexual arousal, and a very common side effect of psychiatric medications that worldwide we have not grappled with effectively is weight gain. Weight gain can result in lowered self-esteem, feelings of physical unattractiveness, and it can be very difficult to express your sexuality, to reach out to and develop a relationship when you feel physically unattractive. Many people with serious mental illness have concerns about reproduction and parenting. They don't know if they're up to that. They don't know if we'll support them if they become pregnant and have a child. They know there are, at least in my country, residences where they can't live with a child. And finally, some people with serious mental illnesses feel the need to hide their mental illness when trying to establish new relationships because of negative beliefs, prejudice, and discrimination, stigma, associated with having a psychiatric diagnosis. So as a result, they may begin a relationship with a lie, without sharing one of the most important, relevant things without them. And this then can lead to the failure of the ability to maintain intimate relationships. There are also a number of reasons that clinicians and family members, either explicitly or implicitly, discourage sexuality and intimacy among people with serious mental illness. These include concerns that the person may make bad decisions about relationship partners, may choose the wrong person, as if that isn't something that everyone does. That is a common experience. That's a learning experience. Families and clinicians may feel that a person may be taken advantage of or abused by an intimate partner. That's a very real fear. But one doesn't deal with that by trying to prevent people from having intimate partners. They deal with it by providing the skills and the behavior and the support to not be taken advantage of, to learn to recognize a predatory potential partner. There's a lot of worry in the process of recovery that recovering will be too stressful for people, as if having a mental illness is not stressful. Many things seem funny on the face of thinking about them, but let's face it, one of the most difficult emotional tasks for people, for adults, is to have an intimate relationship, to deal with the ups and downs of a marriage or of a boyfriend-girlfriend situation. So there's concern that the development of a romantic relationship may be too stressful, may lead people's symptoms to be exacerbated and for a hospitalization to occur. I ask you, who's ever had a relationship that did not involve sad feelings sometimes? That did not involve intense anger at your husband or your wife? That's what relationships are. And part of recovery is preparing people to feel those relationships, not just from employers and coworkers, or from their neighbors, or from their family members, but also from their intimate partners. Very common is the concern that intimacy will lead to sexual relations, followed by pregnancy and parenthood. And the fear then that potential offspring will have mental illness. And what will that mean? How will the entire family unit cope with that? What will be done? all of these feelings and attitudes, the individual's own feelings, as well as the feelings of families and service providers, create confusion and uncertainty, which can get in the way of recovery for people with serious mental illness. In addition to that, many of the folks that we work with have sexual orientations that are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual. In the United States, we refer to this as GLBT, so we don't have to say all those words. I'm going to do that too. Forgive me if you don't, but you'll know what I mean. We have to be attuned to this issue in the people that we work with, because GLBT people are at higher risk for depression, anxiety, and substance use disorders. For example, one study found that they were 2.5 times more likely than heterosexual men and women to have had a mood, anxiety, or substance use disorder in their lifetime. So the GLBT copers that we work with are at greater risk for additional mental health difficulties and more vulnerability due to poor mental health. Part of the problem here is not with the person who has a mental illness. It's the result of our very normal and understandable paternalism toward people diagnosed with serious mental disorders. For many years, they lived primarily in hospitals. We came to think of them as people that needed to be protected. Now they do not live in hospitals. They primarily live with us in the community. Therefore, this protectiveness is misplaced. We need to learn as a society, as professionals, as family members, as neighbors, as religious leaders, how to deal with this misplaced protectiveness, and to realize that people with mental illnesses deserve the same opportunity to take the same risks as we all take to have relationships and have access to the same rewards as we all have in these relationships. One of the problems here is that copers and the staff who work with them often see things very differently. And this is true in regard to many areas of rehabilitation and recovery, not just sexuality. This is an interesting study published by McCann fairly recently, in which service users, copers, were asked if they had needs, service needs related to sexuality, and then their staff, the people who worked with them, were asked whether they felt they had needs related to sexuality. And look at the difference. 90% of the copers said, yes, I need some help with sexual expression. But only 10% of the service providers thought that that need was present in the people they work with. 83% of people felt they needed help with intimate relationships. Here I would say, don't we all? If I could offer you some help with your intimate relationship, and it was free and confidential, would you not take it? So it's interesting that less than half of the service providers thought that the people that they work with needed help establishing, maintaining, and having healthy, intimate relationships. Studies of gay and lesbian clients also indicate that their views of how their psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and counselors feel about their sexuality are, in some respects, positive, and in other respects, negative. I find it actually very reassuring that more than half of each of these 4 groups of service providers, when gay and lesbian people were asked, is your therapist not afraid to address sexual orientation with you when relevant, said yes. That's pretty good. Are you a little surprised at that? I was. So that part is very, very good. However, people don't always feel understood. There was a small minority in every profession who were perceived by their patients, again, this is not an objective look, at what went on in the therapeutic relationship. It's the patient's perception of whether the therapist would rather that the person not be gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transsexual. And reports of LGBT individuals about their health providers confirm these same kinds of attitudes. I think what's important for us to understand if we want to think deeply as clinicians about these issues is that part of recovery for people with serious mental illness involves uncovering, grappling with, and then integrating their sexual self. And this integration occurs not just in terms of their illness, but also in terms of their life. This rather complicated diagram, and I apologize for that, is the result of a study of individuals with schizophrenia and an attempt to understand how they integrate their sexuality into their lives, into their coping with their schizophrenia, and how they come out at the other end of this process as more whole, more healthy individuals. And basically what the researchers found in this study that I think is very, very important, and for those of you who are not as familiar with the mental health field, schizophrenia is a mental health diagnosis that is often, but not always, accompanied by high levels of functional impairment, difficulty working, living independently, having social relationships, finishing school. But these individuals, and the major finding of this study, was that they grew to perceive their sexuality as part of their overall well-being, their sense of their self, regardless of their mental illness, but that they could also express how their mental illness was part of their sexuality and part of their attitudes toward intimacy. Over on the left-hand side of this diagram was a finding that grew out of this research that people described their sexuality in terms of its meaningfulness to them personally. All of the people interviewed, and schizophrenia is often thought of as a disorder where people don't have insight, can't express their feelings, don't have deep thoughts like this. But in this case, after intensive interviews with individuals, what emerged was the notion that every one of them had their own personal definition of sexuality based on specific things like their gender, or their religion, or their family background. They didn't lack that definition, it was there. And if you're a clinician, it was there to uncover. If you sought to ask for it, and if the individual felt comfortable and trusting enough to share it with you. People describe many forms of sexual expression, the way they dressed, the way they wore their hair. Men talked about the tightness of their pants. This was the way in which they conveyed how they felt about their sexual selves. And they knew that. They talked about their seeking satisfaction, what kind of satisfaction they desired. And they also talked about sexuality and the meaningfulness of sexuality being much more intense when they could share it with another person. The importance of that to their overall view of their sexual self. The dimension in the middle brings the illness to the forefront. People spoke about the fact that in order to be comfortable with their sexuality and feel truly integrated, they needed to grapple with the way in which their schizophrenia interacted with that individual perception of their sexuality. They had to develop a sense of their sexual self-image and truly recognize that their mental illness was compromising it. Not deny that, not pretend that it didn't exist, but grapple with that. They had to adjust to changes in sexual functioning from their medication side effects, from their altered body image. Many people in this research speak about being overweight or obese, and the difficulties adjusting to that, and then going forward with their lives, not just with sexuality, but as a worker. Research shows that it's very difficult to get hired into a job if you're obese. As people that live in the community, landlords don't want to rent to people who are obese. There is a huge amount of discrimination against overweight and obese people. And we forget that that's a dimension that tends to co-occur with serious mental illness and impact this area. Wanting to be in a deep, intimate relationship and grappling with your schizophrenia leads pretty expectedly to fears that this will never be possible, that only rejection will occur when you reach out and try to form bonds that are intimate with other individuals. And there was also concern with being unable to meet role expectations. The recognition that the illness would interfere with their psychosocial development, that they didn't have all the skills and the knowledge that other people had because of their schizophrenia. And a searching and a wondering how they could acquire it. Feeling not to be a whole person, feeling rejected and judged by other people. And finally, viewing the impact of their illness not just on their sexuality, but on every other area of their life. And feeling the overwhelmingness of this, and trying to figure out where to prioritize sexuality in their recovery. Over to the far right-hand side of this diagram was the result of this research that people described how they manage their illness as a whole and how they manage their sexuality along with their illness as part of their life. They did this by dealing with their sexual issues and regaining a sense of control of sexuality, not just a sense of control of their illness. They engaged in testing and were willing, if they felt trusting enough with the researcher, to talk about the times when they knew they'd been a bit outrageous, gone a bit too far, weren't sure if they should have made an advance to a particular person, or should have accepted the offer of a date. But the need to test those boundaries was essential in deciding who they were and how they could manage both their schizophrenia and their need for intimacy. They came to see their sexuality as an integrated part of their personalities. They could accept themselves and their sexuality because they understood both now. As one gentleman said, "I'm outgoing, I'm talkative. Everybody likes that in a social setting. But when I act that way sexually, everyone gets very nervous. They tend to describe it as symptomatic. I now understand that that's the way I am as a sexual person. But I also understand that if people know I have schizophrenia, they're likely to interpret that as a symptom." That's a very high level of understanding and insight about the ways in which your illness and your sexuality play out in relating to other people. People spoke about becoming more comfortable with other people's rejection of their sexuality, didn't mind being ignored or not being ignored. Many people felt that they had used their illness as an opportunity. As one woman said, "I've had so much training in insight and emotion management and understanding my emotions, but that's helped me become a better romantic partner, helped me be more sensitive to my boyfriend." So they were able to see how some positive things had grown out of their illness. And in the end, many felt that they had reclaimed a positive sexual self-image. They had a positive sense of themselves, not invulnerable, not without faults, not without recognizing discrimination and misperceptions on the part of outsiders, but something that they could feel comfortable with, a sense of themselves as sexual beings that enabled them to still have hope and to set goals for themselves in the area of sex, in the area of all other kinds of life. I think that this deep understanding, perhaps a lot deeper than you wanted to listen to today, but maybe not, can give us a sense of the different ways that we can help people with serious mental illness develop their individual conception of sexuality, of themselves, their personal sense of themselves as a sexual being, an understanding of how their diagnosis and its effects on their emotions impacts that definition, and then come out at the end of this process making some peace with all of this and having a sense of hopefulness and a sense of confidence and ability to move forward with whatever the result of that process has been. So where does intimacy fit in the recovery model? A key principle of recovery is that we try to minimize the loss of valued social roles. That's what it's all about. It's the recognition that, like any other chronic long-term illness, people are generally not going to be symptom-free. People with arthritis do not wake up someday and have no more pain. People with asthma generally don't see a total remission of their symptoms. People with cancer are always cancer survivors in the sense that they carry it with them, even if they are in remission. The same thing is true with mental illness and the concept of recovery. It doesn't matter if the individual still has symptoms, if medications and therapy can only control them up to a certain part. Recovery is about learning to live with that, integrate it into your personality, go on and create for yourself a life of dignity, of meaning, a life where you contribute back to the society that supports you. And part of that is clinicians helping clients and copers helping each other restore the valued social role of boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, intimate partner. And that's why recovery is a perfect paradigm for what we're talking about today. Some clinicians see these roles as possible stressors, and they are. They are for all of us. But they're also powerful motivating forces that lead people to want to recover, to lead people to want to maintain their wellness. Wanting to be well for your son or your daughter is an incredibly strong force. Wanting to get your act together so that you can find a boyfriend or a girlfriend is a reason to take medication, a reason to keep trying, to get up in the morning and go forward when you're not really feeling up to it. What happens when sexuality is not part of recovery? Well, one thing that happens is that treating psychiatrists aren't attuned to or feel it's their responsibility to address things that get in the way of intimacy and sexual expression, like blunted emotions, anhedonia, apathy, social indifference, and reduction in sex drive. When sexuality is not part of recovery, we don't care about those things. For many copers, medications are a barrier. And I find it very interesting that in the study that I just told you about, with people with schizophrenia, they understood very well that the medications they took had sexual side effects. But all of them said that because the medications made them feel better, made their symptoms controllable enough so that they could reach out to other people, kept them out of the hospital, kept them living in the community. They were willing to deal with those side effects. But they didn't always feel that they were getting help with that. And I think that's an important lesson and message for us to understand. People do need to receive information from medical staff about what sexual side effects may occur with their medications. Prescription warnings do need to convey information to people about things that many people don't expect. A man who has milk leaking from his breasts for the first time, a sexual side effect, is humiliated, embarrassed, frightened. This is a side effect he should have known about when the medication was first prescribed. Providers sometimes and not meaning to be bad people, convey that sexual side effects are a necessary evil. If you want to be well, you're just going to have to put up with it. And sometimes that's true. But better is to work with the individual to try different medications and see if a medication regimen can be arrived at that controls people's symptoms, but has the fewest sexual side effects, if that's what the individual wants. Sometimes people don't address these things because they feel that if they're honest with folks about medication side effects, that people won't take their medications. But what the research shows is, because they're not honest with people, because people aren't prepared, because they experience a troubling, horrifying side effect, that's when they decide not to take their medications. So these types of changes in practice, prescribing practices, as well as educating people about psych meds and side effects, are things that support medication adherence, not interfere with it. The result otherwise is that people blame themselves, they're shocked and ashamed when these side effects occur, and they remain fearful in intimate relationships and feel as if they've failed. One of the things that we can do, and normally if I was giving this talk in the United States and was trying to make the link between avoiding stigma and discrimination in terms of sexuality by following the core principles of psychiatric rehabilitation, I'd have to educate my audience about what psychiatric rehabilitation is. It's so nice to not have to do that. To talk to people who come from a system that recognizes this. So the principles that support the field of psychiatric rehabilitation are very helpful to us here. Treating everyone with respect and dignity in regard to their sexuality as well as their sexual orientation should come as second nature to people who practice psychiatric rehabilitation. Consciously eliminating labeling and discrimination, particularly around issues of sexual preference, is also something that is true to psychiatric rehabilitation, and its avoidance of stigma. Its avoidance and fighting back with the community when the community labels people or says, don't put that residence in my neighborhood. Those people should live somewhere else. Psychiatric rehabilitation providers, social workers, psychiatrists, psychologists, when you operate from a perspective of rehabilitation, you're used to fighting with people on behalf of the folks that you serve. So it's easier to integrate this into the way you do your service delivery. Designing services to address the unique needs of people who are fully embracing both mental illness and their sexuality is important. I'm not saying it's easy. It's much easier in many ways to run a residence where no one has sex with each other, where there are no children, where husbands and wives don't live together and occasionally fight and get angry and slam doors and don't talk to each other around the dinner table. But those kinds of residences create barriers to something that is an essential human right and something that's a motivator for recovery. So we need to figure out how we can provide all of the challenging services of psychiatric rehabilitation in a way that allows people to be sexual beings, but also safely and without getting sued, and also to figure out how we can do this in a supportive way and in a way that doesn't convey unintended messages, as in, it's so difficult to make the service available to you, it would be much simpler if we didn't do it this way. In other words, constantly striving to improve services, constantly questioning, are we meeting the needs, the sexual and intimacy needs of the people we're serving? Are we delivering services in a way that's respectful and honors this? Are we perhaps embarrassed by our own sexuality and therefore have difficulty discussing it with our clients? Are we afraid of opening up the floodgates that might come from discussing sexuality and intimacy with clients because our supervisors don't want the hassle of supporting us as we're delivering services. All of these are typical questions in psychiatric rehabilitation. They don't only have to do with sexuality, they have to do with reaching for and achieving any challenging goal. We just need to recognize that they're part and parcel of the delivery of services that we want to deliver. The program standards for the administrators in the room, and later on this afternoon I'm going to be talking about more specific ways that administrators and program directors can work toward actualizing these values and creating programs that make it possible for people to fully integrate their sexuality into their recovery. But in a general sense, our programs should support open, consensual, sexual relationships between adults, regardless of form, within the cultural context that is considered normative. Okay? If you come from a culture where no one has sex before marriage, then that's not normative. And you have to adjust that standard to the culture in which you're operating. But adjusting it all the way to don't have sex is not the right adjustment, because that's not true for the larger culture. Operating residential programs for married or committed couples is a standard we should strive toward. Providing supports and skills training for parents and their children in both clinical and residential programs. Including and openly acknowledging GLBT members, patients, and I might add staff. And educating both staff and clients regarding people's right to intimacy and sexuality, and being careful to prohibit discrimination, while also being mindful of the rules and the regulations that you have to operate programs under. That part of this process involves protecting people who are vulnerable, who don't have the training to recognize and avoid predatory relationships. It's a very, very tough thing to juggle. But if these standards aren't met, then intimacy and sexuality can't be core components of recovery. I want to say just a little bit about establishing safe zones in mental health programs. It's a major trend in the United States, and it refers to putting up a symbol that means to people that the staff there have a commitment to be understanding, supportive, and trustworthy should GLBT service users, co-workers, or others need help or suggestions or someone to talk to about this. So I want to mention that because that's a hard thing for programs to do and something to consider. But I want to also end with the idea that we sometimes feel this huge weight on our shoulders as clinicians, because we often know that we're one of the few entities that care about people with serious mental illness. I don't know about Israel, but in the United States, they're a group that most people could live without. Would rather not hear about them, would rather not think about them, would rather not prioritize money for them, would prefer that they become invisible as they were when they lived at psychiatric hospitals. So the idea that we sometimes come away with, and also the idea that copers develop when they begin to assume responsibility for their community, when they realize that at the end of the day, it's up to them to stand up for other people with serious mental illness. We have the tendency to feel that it's all on our shoulders, and it's not. Clinical service providers, peers, only one set of actors supporting intimacy and sexuality in the recovery process. We need to have as partners family members, friends, neighbors, employers and co-workers, religious leaders. And what that means is we have to help those people change their values and their attitudes. We have to be ambassadors through the way that we talk about people with mental illness and their sexuality. How we don't allow people to joke or make assumptions that those people shouldn't be parents or those people shouldn't have sex. Because part of making recovery a reality involves recognizing that no one recovers in a society where people feel they have no value. and that you as an individual can only do so much to make that kind of recovery possible. It requires that the entire society embrace people, and this is true in terms of sexuality as well. I want to encourage all of you who speak English to visit my website for my center. We have many materials there that deal with issues such as this, curricula where you can educate copers about sexual issues, and all of the materials are free. Many of them can be downloaded directly from the internet. I would direct you specifically to a page on recovery tools for some of these materials, and I'll be happy to talk individually with you about how to access them in particular ones. But for now, I just want to say how unusual it is to come from a country where one of our presidential candidates believes that even within marriage, women should not use contraception, and come to a country where this topic is openly discussed, where people care about this as part of recovery, where people from a variety of cultures and religious backgrounds are willing to grapple with these issues. You should applaud yourselves. I know you're going to clap for me, but I hope you'll clap twice as hard and add some applause for yourselves for caring about this issue. Thank you all very much. No idea what time it is. Did I talk for a half hour? An hour? Most of you are still awake? Is there time for questions, or is it time to move on to the next part of our agenda? Right about time. So what that means is that I am available for questions. Wherever you choose to grab me and ask for help or ask for advice, I will talk to you. Perhaps only in the ladies' room will I ignore you for a moment, but I will finish the conversation. And also check out the workshop this afternoon if you're an administrator. Okay? And I think now it's time to go on to the next segment of the program.